Jill, here's a lockpick.
Resident Evil Retrospective.
The moans of walking corpses may echo louder today than they did decades ago, but the undead have roamed the gaming landscape ever since 1972, when Haunted House opened its doors on the Magnavox Odyssey, complete with a screen overlay and playing cards. The Atari 2600 got its own pixelated mansion of terror 10 years later, as players guided a pair of eyes through a labyrinth of dimly lit rooms. Adaptations of popular slasher flicks also became controversial interactive entertainment, with Wizard Video's remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween, along with LGN's 8-bit attempts at simulating Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street on the NES in 1989. Already responsible for arcade and console bombshells like Street Fighter, Final Fight, and Mega Man, that same year, Capcom released a horror RPG exclusively for the Famicom called Sweet Home. The game was used to promote a film of the same name, and the two were released simultaneously. In the mystery adventure, players controlled a party full of characters with special abilities necessary to escape a cursed mansion. In 1990, 25-year-old Shinji Mikami was hired by Capcom to work on Disney games like Aladdin and Goof Troop. After 4 years of Child's Play, Mikami set his sights on the PlayStation and its CD-based medium. His first concept was an ambitious 2D-3D hybrid horror shooter that would augment the launch lineup of Sony's new machine. The game was ambitious, but pure evil and polygons had met before. Alone in the Dark from Infogrames put its blocky lead characters in imposing environments shown through artfully placed camera angles back in '92. Mikami wanted the game to share elements with Sweet Home, primarily the puzzle structure and mansion setting. The project started as a first-person shooter with aliens, before developers considered pre-rendered backgrounds, connected by cleverly presented loading screens, and the pale-faced zombies of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Capcom launched the horror thriller on March 29, 1996. They called it
Biohazard.
Americans were given a different title,
Resident Evil.
The 3 to 6 hour campaign could be taken by one of two characters, Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. The separation yielded alternate inventory capacity, defensive power, special items, advanced weapons, supporting cast members, and multiple endings. Despite being separated, both Chris and Jill had the same objective: uncover the secret of a cryptically constructed house and escape alive. A noticeable deficiency of healing items and ammunition encouraged the developers to market Resident Evil as a new genre, called survival horror. The two protagonists, along with weapons expert Barry Burton, mechanic Joseph Frost, pilot Brad Vickers, and team leader Albert Wesker, were members of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS. They made up Alpha Team and found themselves combing the dark woods outside Raccoon City in search of Team Bravo. STARS had been assigned to investigate reports of cannibalistic behavior resulting in several deaths among the dense forests of the Arklay Mountains. After discovering the remains of Bravo's chopper, Frost was ambushed, forcing Alpha to take shelter in an empty mansion.
What is this?
Wow, what a mansion!
Some primitive detective work led to the game's first unsettling moment, an introduction the industry would not soon forget. Bravo Team's Kenneth Sullivan had met his end at the hands of a zombie. and it would be the first of many. To make matters worse, Wesker vanished, most of the doors were locked, and rabid dogs were clawing at the front door. Jill and Barry parted ways, and Chris linked up with Bravo rookie medic Rebecca Chambers. Barry supplied additional ammo and rations, and Rebecca assisted in riddle solving and healing Chris's wounds. Resident Evil was broken up into 4 chapters: the mansion, the courtyard, the guardhouse, and the laboratory. The barriers between each were blocked by a series of keyholes or cranks, and multiple rooms existed solely to house a complex puzzle. Inventory items could be sorted, combined, and even examined in 3D to reveal hidden clues. A handful of rooms had a universal item container that could be accessed from multiple locations, along with the typewriter for saving the game if a collectible ink ribbon was acquired. Health was replenished by ingesting herbs that could be mixed for maximum potency, or using first aid spray. In between the storage room safe havens and hiding around nearly every corner was a mobile graveyard of mutated monsters, some of which made the foot-dragging zombies look like target practice. Mutilated Cerberus dogs roamed the gardens, squealing hunters leapt out from the shadows, wall-clinging chimera swooped down from the ceiling, and large spiders spit poisonous venom, escaped sharks prowled the basement, and even bees became an unwelcome nuisance. While each of these encounters could be struggled through or avoided entirely, Chris and Jill had no choice but to confront a giant snake and a botanical abomination called Plant 42.
The stars are doomed. Someone is a traitor. Everything was plotted from the start by Umbrella. Ha!
But the real monstrosity turned out to be the man with the plan, Albert Wesker. Numerous clues hinted at a traitorous presence among stars, and in Jill's campaign, Wesker even blackmailed Barry into being his slave. Wesker, along with the numerous scientists players had killed a second time, were connected to a medical conglomerate called Umbrella. The massive corporation had the scientists on their payroll to produce a controlled mutation called the T-virus. The T stood for Tyrant, the embodiment of the virus's potential, and the game's final boss. Seeing Wesker disposed of, Jill or Chris had to gun Tyrant down. If you kept your eyes peeled, you could pick up 3 optical drives in the mansion and translate 3 codes to open a locked cell containing either Jill or Chris. If they failed to do this, they left the team member behind. The helicopter landing pad appeared to be a mere story transition into the end credits, but completists met Tyrant a second and final time before the helicopter could land. Brad dropped a rocket launcher, and Tyrant went boom. The self-destruct system leveled the mansion grounds shortly after Brad's chopper took the survivors into the sunset. Resident Evil sold just over 2.7 million units, becoming the PlayStation's best-selling horror title. Reviewers at the time were wowed by the game's haunting atmosphere. Its numbing musical score kept players just tense enough to drop some of the genre's most infamous scares. Cleverly composed articles, letters, and diary entries scattered throughout the property created a remarkably deep undercurrent of misery that was made even more depressing by the fact that most of the people who wrote them were lying dead before you.
Hurry up! I want to get out of here.
I'm sorry, Jill.
I didn't know that was going to happen.
Standing as a stark and humorous contrast to these enigmatic traces of correspondence were the game's undeniably awful dialogue and voiceover.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
The performances are subject to interpretation, but there's no question Resident Evil has become equally revered for making people scream and making them laugh.
Chris? Stop it.
And although it took intelligent advantage of alone-in-the-dark security cam cinema style, some found the lack of visibility and third-person control disconcerting, and not in the way Mikami intended. For those who enjoyed its life-or-death simulation, Resident Evil was begging for multiple playthroughs. It had 2 characters, and each had multiple conclusions and random events triggered by the directions the player took through the house. Finishing it once opened a closet containing additional costumes, and fleeing the helipad in under 3 hours unlocked a rocket launcher with infinite ammo. Whatever this was that Capcom called survival horror had taken hold, and those who survived the Twisted Mansion were hungry for more. More was 2 years away, so to give the Horde something to chew on in the meantime, Capcom produced Resident Evil Director's Cut. The revision contained an advanced mode that changed camera angles, shuffled around enemies and items, and switched out the starting costumes for Chris, Jill, and Rebecca. These, along with a few other surprises, were designed for people that had memorized the mansion blueprints and would have to rethink their strategy. A second director's cut arrived later with DualShock support and a symphonic soundtrack, and a third became available via the PlayStation Network store. Resident Evil also infested the Sega Saturn and PC. The Saturn port was notable for its added battle game feature, a short escapade through a section of the house using a specific arsenal of weapons. New enemies popped up in both this added minigame and the main storyline. The PC version opened with an unedited color intro that was originally censored for the game's US release. Along with added weapons, the PC also supported higher character resolution. Another edition of Resident Evil was also planned for the Game Boy Color, but Capcom eventually canned it. Six years after the infection began, Capcom completely revamped the Spook and Shoot classic for the Nintendo GameCube. It was the type of concept that fans pray for, but rarely receive. Though veteran STARS members definitely got that old, familiar feeling navigating its narrow hallways again, much of the game was completely reinvented. The voices were recast, the dialogue was rewritten, all the cinemas used the in-game character models, and story elements that had blossomed in the previous sequels were mixed into the narrative. Shinji Mikami had since moved on to other projects, but returned to direct it.
The triggering system has now been activated. All researchers and guards should take cover immediately.
The graphical leap Resident Evil had made in a single generation of console development was utterly astounding. Some locations had the same geographical layout, but the level of detail made them unrecognizable at first. Other zones, like a smoke-filled graveyard and a dimly lit path leading to a seemingly abandoned shed, offered brand new avenues for exploration. Each vantage point was still locked in place, and the areas were pre-rendered, but the result was a near seamless blend of character and environment. Gameplay features that were now second nature helped make engaging zombies a little less stressful. Characters could perform swift 180-degree turns and use defensive weapons when seized by the undead. The port sold over 1.2 million copies, and many consider it the prettiest and scariest entry in the GameCube's library. Nintendo brought the new version of Evil to the Nintendo Wii in Japan at the end of 2008. To celebrate the 10th anniversary of Resident Evil and to prove how far handheld technology had come, Capcom brought RE to the DS in 2006. Subtitled the obvious acronym of Deadly Silence, it placed the action on the bottom touchscreen, with the top displaying the map and character health. Both a classic and rebirth mode were included, with rebirth being yet another jumbled recreation of the same items and weapons. Unexpected first-person knife sequences tested their skills, showcasing a brand new view of that specific room. A few select scenes were also altered to make use of the DS microphone.
What is this?
Wow, what a mansion!
To speed up the familiar process for those that could shoot zombies in their sleep, players could manually reload outside of the menu and skip the original's mandatory loading doors. Running off the console's Wi-Fi, 2 multiplayer modes appeared, one played cooperatively, and another awarding one of 4 potential players with the highest score. Resident Evil for the DS didn't hit the visual standards of the PlayStation, but its ability to run on the platform at all was impressive by itself. Resident Evil originally turned heads because its premise was frighteningly unique. At the time, one would think that limited resources, rampant backtracking, and a permanently static camera would spell disaster for those still experimenting with action games in 3D. But Mikami was willing to get his hands dirty and gamble his fate on gamers craving to outlive the undead. The game's design often left players blind, trapped, and hopeless, but that's the type of horror that memorable nightmares are made of. The question was, would the nightmare continue? In Part 2 of our 6-part Resident Evil retrospective, the fate of Raccoon City is sealed. As Capcom releases 2 direct sequels for the PlayStation, the Lost Town starts its inevitable countdown to destruction. 2 unexpected heroes get caught in a conspiracy, and Jill Valentine plans a desperate escape.